Welcome to Video 9, Evaluating Historical Context and Multiple Perspectives. By the end of this video, you will be able to understand how to read a History Day project for context and what we mean by perspective. Historical context and multiple perspectives are very different rubric marks. But for both, you can remind yourself of two main criteria to check when judging. First, does the bibliography show evidence of research for these areas? And then, where do context and perspective show up in the overall project? Here you'll see what the National History Day rulebook says about historical context and multiple perspectives. Context is defined as the larger setting in which a topic took place. Students may consider many conditions and should pay attention to developments over time. The rulebook gives the example of the civil rights movement, where the context of legal segregation was important to the eventual response of the civil rights movement. Historical perspectives are defined as a point of view, an experience, or a side of the story. Multiple perspectives can include historical perspectives as well as different points of view from individuals. When judging historical context, go through these three steps. First, ask, does the project situate in the events in place and time? Do they have sources that explain broader context? Next, ask whether the context is explicitly discussed. Students may do this in some sections of their project or throughout the project. Finally, consider whether historical context is consistently analyzed. Remember that these projects often have limits. Students do not need to explore all avenues of context for their projects. That would be very hard. In fact, you'll notice that the rubric specifies relevant connections should be made and analyzed. What do we mean by relevant connections? Well, first, it refers to how important it is to the main action of the project. For example, a student with an exemplary project on the Stonewall Uprising should also examine the context of LGBTQ activism leading up to Stonewall. However, they don't need to analyze the mafia ownership of the Stonewall Inn. Though it would certainly be an interesting side note, it may not be the most important thing to examine for this particular project. Next, you should consider the abilities of the students themselves. Younger students may not have the broad background in history as older students have, and therefore will spend more of their time researching one area of context. Also, consider the limits placed on students. The student working on the Stonewall might have been aware of the mafia side story and many other parts of context, but they had to cut it out of their project. This could be a great interview discussion. Let's look at some examples. Remember the pie analogy. What makes a novice different from developing is a bigger slice of the pie. There's not one element you're looking for, but a combination of more elements. This first example is from a novice level, the smallest piece of the pie. Taking from the example of the student working on the Stonewall Uprising, they may briefly mention that actions take place in New York or might note that the LGBTQ community was not widely accepted. They don't go farther than this than explaining the connections of those two facts to the reader. A developing level project will have more details and analysis. For example, a student might make connections between discrimination against LGBTQ people and the tensions that sparked the uprising. They might also mention that Greenwich Village had a large gay community. Look for the ways the student has connected the context of the topic as it might not be clear. A proficient project is going to move from somewhat to mostly descriptors. This is where the student shows that they understand the goal of providing context. Here, a student might include previous actions or groups, like the Compton cafeteria riots or the Mattachine Society, and link those topics to Stonewall. Students at the proficient level should also show analysis of context, making it clear that they understand why the actions they're describing occurred. An exemplary project will include most appropriate connections. The student might go in depth on both Compton's cafeteria riots as well as police raids in New York City bars. They might then describe the greater context of the LGBTQ movement as part of the growing civil rights movement. As you consider context, keep in mind that different project media types will allow students to show the idea of connection in different ways. For example, a paper will clearly describe the context connection to the event, while an exhibit board might use visual elements such as arrows to describe connection. Multiple perspectives ask students to show different points of view. Consider what voices show up in the project. These voices might be found not only from people in the past, but the historical perspective itself. Then, review those voices to see if they actually offer different perspectives. Students sometimes include many different voices or characters, but they might only include voices with perspectives that reflect their own. Students might include multiple perspectives in different ways, such as through the different pages of a website or by having two characters in a performance argue. Finally, ask whether the student has consistently included these perspectives and if they're taken into account when crafting the argument. An exemplary project will have multiple perspectives woven throughout the project and not removed to a single area or section. Thank you for joining Maryland History Day. Next up is Video 10, Historical Accuracy and Significance in History.